in 1977, Carlos Mayolo and me made a film called Agarrando Pueblo, and I edited the film in Paris, and the premiere was held in Paris in 1978. And for the presentation, we published a text, a mimeograph text, or no, I think it was a Xerox copy of a small manifesto called ¿Qué es la pornomiseria? What is poverty porn? Which was like an introduction or an explanation a little bit of what we were dealing with our film, which criticized the films that exploited poverty either for profit or for winning prizes or for a political cause sometimes. It's a very brief text, it's only one paragraph, but it explains the context from which we were departing to make this meta-film, which was shown yesterday.
And I suppose in the context of this project, it should be said that, you know, over the course of the 4 or 5 years that we were working on this, we never had a very clear definition, or we were constantly debating where the limits of Latin American experimental film began and end. We were very emphatic about certain points that, you know, Chicano film and New Yorican filmmakers should be thought of within this, you know, a Latin American diaspora should be thought of within the context of Latin American film production. But then what is experimental film? You know, that's an open question. And one thing that seemed important about your manifesto is that we certainly weren't talking about, you know, Nuevo Cine Latinoamericano or the kind of radical militant film coming out of the 60s and 70s. And your film, Agarrando Pueblo, seemed like it fit very well in terms of some kind of radical critique of a radical cinema.
Yes, well, with regards to classifying that film as an experimental film, well, we didn't depart from that idea. I mean, we weren't saying we were making an experimental film. Only with hindsight is that sometimes that classification comes with a film. In fact, because there was not really an experimental movement in the Colombian cinema. Maybe the first experimental film was La Langosta Azul, which I think you showed at a previous section of this program. It was made by several intellectuals from Colombia, including Garcia Marquez, the painter Enrique Grau, the writer Álvaro Cepeda Zamudio, and it's a film very much influenced by the American underground, I think, and that was done in the 50s. I can't recall exactly what date, 1950, 57 maybe. After that, maybe the next experimental filmmaker would be Luis Ernesto Arocha from Barranquilla as well, who had studied in the United States and made a couple or several short films in New Orleans. One of them is like a sort of a vampire film in a way. Unfortunately, those films are lost, but some of his the work he did further, which could be called experimental, were also shown here. One of them, Asilev, was it? Or Ventanas? Ventanas. He made maybe 3 short films that could be considered experimental. then there are hardly any experimental films in Colombia. It didn't have a movement as such. In fact, I would say that the first film group that was considered a movement would be the Grupo de Cali, to which I belonged, and which started in 1971. And by this, by considering it a movement, it I would say, had several things that qualify for that. I mean, we were filmmakers, film critics. Also, we had a cine club and we had a film magazine, and we were active for a period of 20 years, which after that you can say something can be called a movement in a way.
And Federico, you want to say something about the research you conducted and your contribution to the publication?
Sure. Sure. I had a different body of work to deal with. It was considerably easier for me to I mean, I'm writing a book on Argentine experimental film in the 70s and 80s, and that's a group of it's about a group of filmmakers who consciously sought who characterized their own work as experimental film and were consciously seeking out links to other types of experimental films that they had seen or heard about, specifically in the U.S. and Europe. And so my contribution to the book is just a short text on a film by Marie-Louise Alemann. It's interesting once we start talking about diasporas, so you could say, well, whose diaspora do you want to emphasize? So she's part of the German diaspora, right? But she's been incorporated into Argentine film history. But she's someone who's always going back and forth between Europe and Argentina. But Germany's not interested in saying, she's a German filmmaker, for example. So we get her in Argentina, which is great. So Marie-Louise Alemann is just a fascinating figure in her own right. She's someone who, at the end of World War II, had ended up in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, living in a castle, and had some relatives in Buenos Aires, and decided to go to Buenos Aires, and became part of the social scene of German Buenos Aires and the high society of German Buenos Aires. Ended up marrying a man 35 years older than her, a Swiss-German man who started the first specifically anti-Nazi Jewish school in Buenos Aires, and ran a German language newspaper. She started to write for the newspaper. She started to work on various levels for the newspaper. She was an independent photographer. She started an art practice as a photographer and showed in galleries. And then when she became friends with Narcisa Hirsch, they started to do happenings, and they both, around the end of the 60s, by the end of the 60s, were making short films. And they were making short films very much aware of what had been going on in New York in the 60s, and thinking about figures like Jonas Mekas, but also thinking about the kind of art cinema that they were interested in. And so their work is has elements of art house cinema. Narcisa Hirsch in particular was very interested in the films of Marguerite Duras. Marie-Louise Alemann became obsessed with the films of Herzog, but we're also interested in experimental work, so she made a number of films. She made about 35 films in Super 8. She separated from her husband and became more and more independent and very focused on this filmic practice, and was not only showing her own films, but also when she saw things, she wrote reports from the Berlinale every year. So she would, when she would see something she would be interested in, she would bring it to Buenos Aires.
She published them?
Oh yeah, but it published mostly in the German language newspaper. She had a column, and but she would also she would present films in Buenos Aires. And so after she died in 2015, her daughter let me work with the films and watch them all. They were all in a closet in her apartment. And I had interviewed her and talked to her, to Marie-Louise, but she never really let me see all the films. I think she had gotten a bit protective of them. And so I was very lucky in that her daughter said, yeah, go ahead. And so I sat and watched them on Moviola in Narcisa's studio, and got funding from the Goethe Institute in Toronto and in Buenos Aires to have transfers done of some of what I thought were some of the most interesting films. And one of them was this film that no one had ever really talked about and hadn't been shown in decades, called Umbrales, which means thresholds, which played here, I think Angela showed it, and in a new restoration, thanks to you guys. And Umbrales is the film I wrote about. Umbrales is a film, the title means thresholds, and what struck me about it was that it was a representation of queer experience, the male queer experience in Buenos Aires during the dictatorship. It's a film where she asked friends to, she had a number of gay friends in Buenos Aires, and she asked them to invite their friends to come and work on this film, and I think quite a lot of it was collaborative in the sense that the men came up with some of their own. There's a strong performative dance element to the film, and so a number of kind of typical scenes of harassment, of cruising, are represented in the way the men use their bodies, and she also, with her own camera, kind of lingers over their bodies in an interesting way as a female filmmaker. So there are all kinds of things going on in that film, and that I thought made it, for me, one of the most interesting in her body of work, and so I was happy to write about it.
Thinking of the way that Narcisa Hirsch and Marie-Louise Aleman, they were circulating films, experimental films in Buenos Aires, and the way also they were writing about films as well.
Just Marie-Louise.
Just Marie-Louise. And it's part of one of the goals of this anthology of the book of Ism Ism book was to start a new dialogue among different films and different scenes of experimental cinema in Latin America. And one of the things that we discovered through the process of researching or putting in dialogue researchers that were not in dialogue before is that there were a lot of scenes that were very similar that started a new dialogue, or they were at least this is the beginning, the point of departure of new dialogues in terms of different scenes. So taking that into account, I wanted to ask you the different experiences that you had about reading about experimental cinema or experimental media in general from other places from Latin America, or the way that information regarding other experimental scenes arrived to you. Like, how did you get to read and get to know about other experimental scenes?
No, I never was exposed to experimental, and I think that's very interesting because my beginning is the industry of film. Actually, I'm like the generation of the big stars of Guillermo del Toro, Alfonso Cuarón, and Emmanuel Lubezki. We are the exactly same generation that we started together, and I was absolutely passionate about cinema. But there was a point that I saw that I didn't have any talent for like relationships or getting money for my dreams or whatever. So without ever seeing an experimental or being exposed, of course, it's different because I think that all the inventors of language in the history of cinema are experimental filmmakers, no? From Méliès to Murnau to of course, Buñuel. It's like the liberty that gives you not to be in a conventional language to keep a conventional language. And I think that has to be with freedom, that you don't have to have like a special place in for the audience, like and I don't know how to say that, but anyway, what I felt it was very interesting. It's like when I saw that I didn't have any talent for relationships to go with the producers. No, it was funny because even I work with these superstars that are now superstars in the early 80s, and you could see like Alfonso Cuarón talking to the producer, and I was with the special effects guy, like going like, "What is it made of? Sugar? The glass that it breaks?" And so I was always like very playful about film. I could never take film as a thing of connections and networking and all that. So when I saw that I couldn't make, I didn't have that talent, I got a small camera because my father was an artist. And my father, every single day of his life at 7 a.m., he was in his studio drawing. So I thought like, okay, if I'm going to be a filmmaker, how am I going to develop my way of looking, my way of saying? So I got a small camera as a notebook, and that's how I used it. And what I think it's very interesting is that the tool itself gives you certain repetitions, no? Because I wasn't exposed to there wasn't like any kind of scene of experimental in Mexico. I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't exposed to an experimental. But the media itself, that you have the little camera in your house and suddenly it becomes like this extension of your body, the mirror, the confessional, and the liberty of finding the boundaries of the narratives. So there was like a moment that my work had like connections with Sedi Benning, or I don't know, like I started traveling, and then I started seeing like oh, how wonderful that the tool gives you also the possibilities of a certain language when you have that liberty. But there wasn't a scene in Mexico. We were like islands,
Right.
because of course there were a lot of people making experimental, but we weren't connected. We met each other later. We were like little islands of weirdos, no? That we were like the weirdos that were like in our houses, because even like my first videos, I was like showing them to my friends, no, in bed, like, look what I did, no? It was like strange.
And how then you started circulating with other, like, work with other filmmakers or video artists from Latin America?
Well, a lot with, thanks to Jesse and Experimental. There was of course, we're talking of early 90s. So of course we didn't have internet or anything. And another weirdo, Andrea Di Castro, gave me some like photocopies of some festivals, and I started sending the videos to video festivals.
And maybe a little earlier, people like Sara Minter and Gregorio Rocha were organizing the PIVAC, remember, the Productores Independientes de Video, and trying to, I know Gregorio always had a sort of impresario impulse of like, we should have a group, we should have a micro cinema, we should have an archive, we should have a building and organized screening series. And there was this sort of debate, maybe in the 80s, as to whether you, as you know, the video artists, were just trying to crash the world of real cinema, meaning 35, or whether you were doing something else, or you know, how did it fit in? Was it art? Was it film?
Yes, but I wasn't part of them really. I was always, I have always been very like a loner in a way. Like I work alone. I don't because with them it was funny, because one day Gregorio said, like, you have to give us, and I said, no, I don't have to nothing. It's like I'm completely free to do what I want. So I was always like a loner in a way. But anyway, that's like the personal history that I don't care about. But I do care a lot of how the tools give you like a certain way of telling the story or using the medium. No?
And I suppose for Maria Luis Aleman, Super 8 had some of that potential, right? That you could, it was cheap, it wasn't censored.
Yeah, there's a lot in the generally in the discourse on Super 8 internationally that prefigures the way people will talk about portable video. So a lot of the way that filmmakers talked about Super 8 in the 70s and in the early 80s, they talked about the fact that it was not just portable, but it was it had a relationship to the body that a lot of the discourse on Super 8 prefigures or echoes what you hear in discussions of portable video. Not the discourse on video initially so much, because they were big, unwieldy things, but by the time you get to Sadie Benning and the Pixel Vision camera and things like that, you find all these echoes of things that were being said about Super 8. So yeah, but I just wanted to go back to the idea, what you were talking about, of kind of maybe networks or hearing about films or seeing things, and how do you insert yourself into that kind of thing. And I discovered that in Argentina in the 70s, well, all these filmmakers that I've spoken to would say to me, well, we would read about things, with the exception of Narcisa and Maria Luis, because they could travel. They were both very wealthy, and so they could travel and watch films and instead of just reading about them. But all the other filmmakers would read about Micas, would read about experimental film, particularly from the U.S. And Claudio Caldini has said, well, there was this translation in this magazine of a Gene Youngblood article about Jordan Belson. That was one of the things that gave me a sense of what experimental film could be. But I didn't see any Jordan Belson films, right? He would say, he just read this long article. That article was translated by Miguel Greenberg, and Miguel Greenberg was this figure who had gone to New York in around 1964, and because he was fascinated by the beat poets, and that's where he met Jonas Mikas, and through Greenberg, the New American Cinema brought a 45-film program to Buenos Aires in 1965, where they showed everyone you can think of. They showed Bruce Conner, they showed Brakhage, they showed an enormous number of filmmakers from the New American Cinema scene at the Di Tella Institute, but there were almost no filmmakers in the audience. It was artists, and the Cinemateca Nacional in Argentina bought, which was it wasn't a national cinematheque, it's a privately owned cinematheque. It bought a number of the films. And so those films still to this day remain in Buenos Aires, and so they were screened regularly. And I started to do research looking at newspapers every day in the 1970s. Certain newspapers would publish daily film screenings, and I started to see all of these experimental films and festivals and showings at embassies. And I realized, okay, on the one hand, there's the phenomenon of just reading about films you can't see. But then, on the other hand, there is this other phenomenon of films being screened to nobody, or films being screened and you don't know who saw those films, but it wasn't the people who went on to make experimental films. So they would say, we had no opportunity to see anything, and I would kind of go, well, actually, if you just opened the paper, you would have seen that things were being shown all the time, but maybe you're doing something else. Maybe, it was also decentralized. There was no community around it. There was a community around Super 8 where they tried to show things. They went to the wrong place. At first they went to the Uncipad, this kind of amateur film showcase, and they were kind of, booed off the stage, basically. So in the 70s, that was you had on the one hand these very sophisticated upper class women who could go and watch all kinds of stuff and then report back. And Narcisa bought some films, not a lot at first, but she bought a few films. Like she bought a Super 8 reduction print of Window Water Baby Moving, and so she could show a few things to her friends, but really they were either reading about it, and I found an enormous amount in the newspapers. Like there's a leftist newspaper called L'Opinion, which had an article on the London Filmmakers Co-op, on Warhol's films, on an enormous amount of work. So you could read about it, or if you were paying close attention and trying to see everything going on in the enormous city of Buenos Aires in the 1970s, you could have seen some stuff, but they didn't mostly. So it was a lot of missed. It was just, I'm not sure what the term is, but there were things that were happening that they were missing.
That reminds me that Caldini actually knew about the Diego Risque's work, but he actually hadn't seen it, and that happens in a lot of filmmakers in Argentina. They haven't seen Diego Risque's works, but they know about them, right? And also reminds me about this beautiful story that you mentioned yesterday. That, for instance, Carlos Mayolo was not able to watch. I think it was Pino Solana's Laurales Hornos, and you actually narrated to him the film, and you recorded the audio, so you were like playing the audio and describing the film for him. Right? It's like a more radical way of circulating that. But also, in Cali, you had the Ojo al Cine. There was sort of a publication that was part of the group.
Yes, but I got acquainted with the experimental films was when I was in high school in Boston. I studied the last 2 years of high school in Boston, and I started going to the MIT Film Society and to a place that was an old synagogue that was then turned into a discotheque called the Boston Tea Party, and they had shows of the Andy Warhol films. There I saw Chelsea Girls with the double projection, and several of Warhol films. And at the MIT Film Society, I saw especially the American underground films. And I started reading Film Culture, the publication of Jonas Mekas, where all these people like P. Adam Sidney started writing, and even European experimental filmmakers were writing there. Then after that, I'm talking, this was 66 to 68, the period that I was in Boston. Then when I came to Los Angeles, in UCLA, I was exposed to more experimental films in a course that was very good. I haven't been able to remember the professor. He was from New York. Maybe his last name was Scholar, or I don't know. But
Donald Scholar?
Huh?
Donald Scholar?
Maybe. I have been for years trying to remember what his name is.
Might have been Donald Scholar. Yeah, Jeffrey's father.
And in that course, he showed us practically everything that was made in the American underground film. So starting with the films of Maya Deren. But of course, there's a misunderstanding. There's this misunderstanding that American underground film started with Maya Deren, which is not true. I mean, there are precedents like Paul Strand and the movie, the story of Hollywood Extra, Manhattan, all these experimental films that were made in the late 20s and the 30s. But anyway, what was big at that time, the word experimental wasn't used as much as underground films. And they had a circulation. I used to go to, I think, a place called here in the Los Angeles called The Egg and the Eye, which showed movies and foreign European movies. But it was mainly in this course at UCLA. And there I was exposed to filmmakers that influenced me very much, among them especially Bruce Conner. You know? But that was my acquaintance with film, with experimental films. But what you say is very true. Us that lived in Latin America, we were very far away from the films. They would never arrive. We would read about them. And in the early when we had the Cine Club and the magazine, we had subscriptions to practically all the magazines that were published in English and some in French, and of course in Spanish. So we were always reading about films. Our film education, it was mostly through the word, not the actual films.
Yeah, and there's even Narcisa here, she could travel a lot, would hear about certain films she couldn't see, and she had a niece, or her husband had a niece, who wrote an article for Film Culture about the Michael Snow film A Casing Shelved, which is it's a slide of a bookcase in Michael Snow's studio, and the audio is a tape of him describing for 45 minutes every object in the bookcase and telling you its relationship to his work as an artist. And his idea was it's a film because he's telling you what to look at, and so your eye is like the camera, you're moving around the slide picture. The slide never changes. And so she heard about this and she thought, well, that's really interesting. I'm going to make a film inspired by this film I've never seen. So there's this history also. I think you could write a history of not just Latin American, but a whole range of kind of subaltern films, film cultures where you respond to the imagined film that you never were able to see, that you read about, or that you maybe saw a still of it in a magazine or a book, and somehow that's generative. That's allowed you to then make another a work in response to it, or based on some idea. So then she made a single shot film we'll watch tonight.
Federico, I just wanted to follow up on something that you said, where you mentioned that when you interviewed Maria Luisa Alemán, she was very reticent about letting you watch her films, and she had them, but they didn't really circulate at that point. And I'm wondering if you had shown up, 40 years earlier, those films would have screened with the Super 8 reductions that Narcisa bought in private screenings in their homes or studios, or what were the forums where that kind of work, Buenos Aires Avant-Garde shared its productions?
The films that Narcisa bought and brought back, she would just show privately. No, wait, that's not true. I discovered a month ago in an obscure film magazine that she put out an ad saying, or in the early 80s, saying that Narcisa Hirsch has started like a kind of film collection and will start to show these films, and sort of gave a list of what they were. But in the 70s, so what they did was they started, because Narcisa and Marie-Louise knew people in what is sometimes called German Buenos Aires, they heard that the Goethe Institute in Buenos Aires had an auditorium available they were going to start using to show films. And so because they were so unhappy with the screenings at the amateur film societies, they took over that space a few times a month to show experimental films, and so not just to show their own work, but to show work from other countries, and to run like seminars and workshops. They got the Goethe to create an experimental film competition, which had prizes. Like they would give you film. No, even they gave film away so people could participate in the competition. And they had like a cash prize or something like that. And they consciously used the term experimental film. And it's interesting, the discourse on the underground film, at least in Buenos Aires, by the early 70s, is about underground film being something of the past. There's a magazine called Teatro 70 from 1970, an experimental theater group. They all lived together in a commune and had their own magazine. They had one issue that was called Underground is Kaput. And it was a timeline starting in the 1950s and ending in 1970. And the argument of the timeline was underground theater, underground film, all of that is dead. And this is a timeline of when this was its heyday. And you can also find a kind of parallel in, 'cause last year I wanted to compare this to the Mexican situation. So last year I was doing the same thing I do in Buenos Aires, just in Mexico. I was reading the newspapers every day, Excelsior, El Día, and when underground would come up, Mexican filmmakers would say, that's something of the past. That's something, it's something that you guys are interested in because it's sensational, you're as journalists, but we've moved on beyond this idea of underground film. And Buenos Aires was one of the few places where a group of people, filmmakers said, okay, well, then we're going to take up experimental film consciously and try to extend that tradition into the present.
And the references for that timeline were both national and international. The Living Theater in New York and the equivalent in Buenos Aires, or how did they imagine the rise and fall of underground?
Yeah, the kind of Living Theater ended. I think they put the end as 1970. They were talking about, what do you mean? Underground, not necessarily vanguardista. That could continue, like an attempt at an avant-garde could continue, but specifically a movement, underground theater, underground film, for some people had died. And in the way that we say now, if I don't know if the New York Times writes about it, it's not interesting anymore. Like in terms of cultural trends, underground film had become so well known. There was a lot of talk about Easy Rider, for example. Easy Rider being a classic example of the sellout, the kind of the end of the underground. Once you get to a film like that,
It's been appropriated.
yeah, it's been appropriated. It was part of the narrative that was circulating in Buenos Aires at the time. Not just in Buenos Aires, also in Mexico. Have we gone very far from the topic?
Well, maybe in Argentina you had the Instituto de Tela, which was a very important movement of artists and cosmopolites in Buenos Aires, whereas in Colombia we were more far away from Europe, closer to the United States. But one thing that made Super 8 known in Colombia was a Super 8 Film Festival made in Cali, where Diego Rizquez showed Sinfonía Tropical, his film about Bolívar, and there was the Caracas Festival de Super 8, started by Julio Neri, in which I participated as well. So that's the way I got to know Diego Rizquez and Carlos Castillo and the other Super Ochistas from Venezuela, because in Colombia there wasn't really a Super 8 movement. Very few films were made in Super 8. I've made a couple, and Enrique Grau and people like that, but not very many people were shooting in Super 8, except whole movies, of course.
So the material, the film and the processing was available, it's just the use that was made of it was for home movies and not for...
Yeah, mostly home movies. When I taught, I was the first film teacher that was at the university in Cali. This was in '79. We made our films in Super 8. And we would have to send them to be developed, and we would get them back by mail. In fact, one of the films got lost in the mail.
Ximena, you started working with preparando, it's like in the archive, right? It's like, and that also is started like as an appropriation of other films and a sort of a way of appropriating films that were circulating, and you were appropriating those films to make your own work. Is that right, or?
Yes, when I was 16, I worked at La Cineteca Nacional in Mexico, and and it was super interesting because in those days it was 1976. 1976, there was a lot of censorship. So the people from the government would watch before getting to the movie theaters, the films, they come to the country, and in the Cineteca, the supervisors will mark the forbidden scenes to cut them out. So to repair the films really was to cut the uncomfortable scenes of naked people or talking about abortion in cabaret, as I was telling you. And I remember very much because it's like a musical, it should be like this easy film, and it was like completely terrifying that that Liza Minnelli had an abortion. So I take out they put it in the trash, the scenes, the outtakes, and so I had a whole collection of them in 35 millimeters. So yes, that was like my beginning to work with appropriate material, no, with the montage. Mm-hmm.
So you would just take home those outtakes and play with them on your moviola at home?
No, I didn't have a moviola because also that's the huge difference. When he says that we couldn't see films, it wasn't just the experimentals. We couldn't see films, period. No, it was like I can remember perfectly well the moment that I had a black box saying like, "What do you mean? There's a film here?" That it was a Betamax cassette. It was like a film that you can take to your house, see the whole thing, because remember those Super 8s that only had like a small fragments of the actual film, and they were Super 8s. No, of course I didn't have a moviola in my house. It was like, I don't know, it was like until the end of, it was super late. Actually, my first work in video, I also made a lot of Super 8 for the same reason, because it was like a pencil, no, to have a Super 8 camera. But then when I started making video, it was VHS. It was VHS, and the editing was from one VHS to the other, the pause and that. No, the technology, now it's a miracle, no?
And when you began making Super 8s, Super 8 as a movement would have already been kaput, as we say, right? When was it? In 1985, they buried the Super 8 camera and had a funeral for it at
Where was that?
Foro Tlalpan,
Oh,
at
really?
Sergio Garcia's space, because they said, video has arrived. The Super 8 is harder and harder to find, more and more expensive, fewer and fewer places to process it. Video is going to take its place, so let's give a proper, goodbye to the Super 8 camera.
That's wonderful.
But I imagine it was right around then when you were starting to make Super 8.
I started making Super 8 in the very, very early 80s, 81, 82, with my one of the persons that I think he's one of the biggest experimental artists in Latin America, who is Ricardo Nikolaevsky. He made actually a body of work that is very powerful, no? The whole portraits of the 80s in New York. And again, how did we show? In those days, we didn't have the thing of now, of like, we're going to make history, we are going to be somebody. It was like the thing of making as you eat, as you get rest. It was like an everyday thing that had nothing to do like with a movement, at least not Ricardo or me or our friends. And with Ricardo, it was wonderful because he would make the films and then we'd go to his place and he'd play the piano and do make different musics and things. But it was only like the audience was like me, my sister, and two other friends, no? It was like the huge audience of this masterpiece that he made.
It wasn't until much later that he recorded a score edited in a computer?
Much, like 20 years later. Actually, I told him one day that I was in his house. I said, like, take them out of the closet. How absurd. Mhm. He wants us to go.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
So,
thank you.
thank you.
And there's one last screening of the weekend. Federico will be presenting a short program of about an hour's worth of films by Narcisa Hirsch. So come back at 7:30. Thanks.
Thank you.